Shall we start? Okay. I only can say, wow. Lea, you're a pop star. The last time we had so many people was 5 months ago when Winston Churchill spoke. Amazing. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, sehr herzlich willkommen einmal mehr beim Schweizerischen Institut für Auslandforschung an der Universität Zürich in diesem Herbstsemester. Ein ganz besonderer Gruß geht natürlich an die Referentin des heutigen Abends, an Professor Lea Ypi, Professorin für politische Philosophie an der renommierten London School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, give Lea a huge hand. Don't say the Swiss don't have a heart. You had already a feeling of that. So, what's next? Dear Professor Ypi, dear Lea, very warm welcome indeed here at Zurich University and the Swiss Institute of International Studies. We are honored and very pleased to have you here, already the second time after an absolutely remarkable and memorable evening at the Zurich Literaturhaus. I think it was 2 years ago or 1 year ago, with a discussion about Lea's fascinating book, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. Free, indeed, is the key word, as well as the notion of the so-called end of history, which, alas, lasted only a couple of years and mostly as a precious illusion. History is back again, and in a more and more brutal and disturbing way of expressing itself in the terms of Thomas Hobbes, homo homini lupus. In fact, exactly 3 weeks ago, Ahmad Mansour, the eminent psychologist and researcher on extremism, gave an important lecture and talked here at Zurich University with us about fanatism and tolerance. 2 days later, the extremist terrorists group of Hamas attacked and slaughtered Israelis on their own ground in the most unimaginable way. Fanatism at its worst, to which the world has no proper answer yet, if ever it will find one. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and in Lea Ypi's conference, the notion of freedom is linked to the modern system of capitalism. How can capitalism foster freedom, or does it not quite, on the contrary, impede it or even prevent it from coming into life for the benefit of as many people as possible? And I think this is indeed a very crucial question since the days of Karl Marx. In his times, Marx saw the grim face of reckless capitalists fight against the goals of the proletarians as, hopefully, the representatives of a new mankind and the forthcoming classless society. His rather Manichaean observation has, of course, undergone a development through theories and thoughts in respect to the contemporary realities of history. Therefore, we also could draw maybe a gap between, let's say, many thoughts of existing state socialism versus a defense of societies based on market liberalism. Theories held by thinkers, for example, like Friedrich August von Hayek and his important book, The Road to Serfdom. Is therefore, we might or should ask, the state a servant in function of society, or is it rather vice versa? Anyway, questions and questions. Lea Ypi was born in Tirana, Albania. Her family, coming from a successful background, was branded under Enver Hoxha as sort of class Elvis. After the annus mirabilis of 1989, Lea visited college before she left her country for Italy, where she studied philosophy and literature in Rome and Fiesole. She then became tutor at University of Oxford and later a professor at the Australian National University before she started to teach at the LSO, London School of Economics, and as a visiting fellow at multiple international universities. 2020, Lea Ypi became a British citizen. We can't wait to hear and learn what Professor Ypi will teach us in the forthcoming 35 to 40 minutes. And afterwards, you know that, as always, you have time to ask your questions. Dear Lea, again, thanks again. It's wonderful to have you, and by the way, also your family here in Zurich. We can't wait. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Zurich. I will say some things that are a little bit more critical of the topic of freedom under capitalism. And on trigger warning, that's the trigger warning. And I am aware that there are quite a few people in the room that identify as capitalists. That's completely fine. As you probably know, communism wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for a capitalist called Engels, who put all his dad's factory money into developing the communist movement, so everyone is on the right track. I'm going to talk about the question of freedom under capitalism, but I really want to connect it to a bigger philosophical question, which is the question of progress. And the question of progress is connected to an old idea, that is to say, the idea of the Enlightenment. And I want to talk about this topic because I think it's a topic that used to be very fashionable and very prominent and has now become obsolete, sometimes dangerous, sometimes threatening. And I think it's also necessary. So progress is a necessary idea if we're trying to make progress and improve the way things are. But it's also a dangerous idea because often the pursuit of progress has given rise to paternalism, to narratives of civilizational superiority, to colonial domination, and so on. And so in this lecture, I want to reflect on the question of freedom under capitalism, but also more broadly on the question of progress, what it is, how we might make progress, and why we need that idea. And I want to suggest that we make political progress not when we approximate an ideal that is always and already given to us, but when our efforts to improve our social, political, and economic conditions reflect what we learned from the trials and the failures of the past. And so to outline how those learning processes take place, I want to reflect then on the question of freedom under the current economic and political system, that is to say, capitalism, and in the current particular institutional framework, and that's to say the nation state. So these will be the main concepts that I will be discussing. But I also, and this goes back to something that Martin said at the introduction, I want to reflect on what we learn from the past, not just with the failures of capitalism in mind, but also with the failures of socialism in mind. And that's where my experience becomes important to me and guides how I think about these topics. And in particular, I want to reflect on that tragic failure that was the experiment with socialism in the 20th century, a failure that I think is primarily responsible for the predicament that we are in now, where we can't really see an alternative to the status quo. And so I want to reflect on both what we can learn from critics of capitalism, but also from critics of real-world socialism, and to see how, if at all, we can then address this question of progress as a learning process that is put in motion when we both have these two failures in mind, but that we also don't want to resign to the idea that it's not possible to move beyond the status quo and that we have to stick with what we have. Because if we are serious about countering the rise of authoritarianism or the far right or anti-liberal movements, we need to reckon with the limitations of our societies. And I want to, at the end of the lecture, hopefully convince you that socialism is actually liberalism minus capitalism. But we'll see how we go. Well, let me start with the more general question first, which is, why do we need the idea of progress? And what does it mean to believe in progress? What does it mean to be a progressive? And I think to answer that question, it helps to place that belief in progress in between two extreme convictions. So the first one is that progress is not impossible. And that sounds plausible, but it's also trivial, because the plausibility of saying that progress is not implausible comes from the fact that the alternative is very weak, because the alternative says progress is impossible, and we do need to stick with what we have, and we do need to just render ourselves pleased with the status quo. And I think that kind of proposition is implausible because it commits us to a kind of prophetic theorizing about the future. It tells us this is how the world will always be, and we can't know that. The second proposition is that progress is necessary, and that's too strong. And that's because in arguing that case, when we say progress is necessary, we misunderstand the nature of the agent that is supposed to make progress, and the agent is humanity, human beings. And that's because that agent is, yes, moral, and wants to make progress, and wants to do the right thing, but on the other hand is also flawed. It's subject to empirical limitations, it's subject to impulses, there is a question of human nature. Human nature isn't always good. Human nature errs in many ways, and there is a pessimistic way of looking at the human. And so we can't say that progress is necessary, because if we say that, it means that we're only thinking about the human as perfectible and always good and always driven by a morally good will. And if we were able to ascribe human beings that always goodwill, yes, we could predict progress towards the better, but since we can't also sustain that progress is necessary. So to believe in progress is to say a little bit more that progress is not impossible, but a little bit less than progress is necessary. And in this lecture, I want to suggest a shift in perspective. So rather than taking bets on is progress impossible or is progress necessary, I think we should look at how human agency expresses itself through social and political institutions by thinking about what those institutions do to promote or hinder that moral agency. And so we need to look at history, the history of humanity, in this very old-fashioned way, which is this philosophical perspective that is now, unfortunately, seems like a bad word. And to think about history from a philosophical perspective means to look at it as if it were a morally purposeful set of events, motives, practical actions, and also contradictory histories. So we need a philosophy of history, and where do we start with that philosophy of history from where we are now, given how unpopular and how problematic philosophies of history are, and how connected they are to this problematic legacy of civilizational discourses being promoted in other parts of the world? I think we should start from both microhistory and macrohistory. So we have to look at microhistory, and this is something that I try to do in my book Free, which is an autobiographical account of growing up in communist Albania and the transition from communism to capitalism, and where I look at how historical events shape the lives of individuals and families that are subjected to these institutions, when these institutions try and fail to promote moral ideals, and when they let people down, and people only have one life to live. And so it's not good enough to say to these families and to say to these individuals, unfortunately, you were the casualty of this progress that we couldn't make. And so it's really important to think about the remainders of history and how history affects, in this tragic way, the micro level and the individuals. And it's from these kinds of failures, and other perspective is the macro history, the history of states, of markets, of institutions, and all the other rules and regulations that people create to guide their conduct. So I think when we think about history from this micro perspective and macro perspective, we need to confront these two different kinds of failures. The failures of both socialist states to deliver on the freedoms they promised, but also of liberal capitalist institutions to expand on the freedoms that they offer beyond particular elites, beyond a handful core of Western countries, and beyond liberal societies and privileged members of liberal societies. So this is where I start. I start with this concern with freedom, and I think the concern with freedom is at the heart of both of these traditions of political thought that are often seen to be antagonistic to each other. The liberal tradition on the one hand, and the socialist tradition that's often seen to be about equality, but that sometimes people claim needs to somehow sacrifice freedom to equality. I think that tradition actually promotes the liberal idea of freedom and tries to radicalize it even further by showing you the limitations of liberal theories that in a way limit the concept of freedom to specific categories of people and don't worry when they not have the inclusive and universal reach that they promise to have. So, on the other hand, we mustn't engage with either socialism or liberalism as just systems of thought. So to think about progress as a process of learning from the trials and the failures of the past, you need to analyze failure in a way that doesn't isolate the systems of ideas from the lives of ordinary individuals who are subjected to these ideas. And I think often in political theory, you engage with ideas as just ideas, and you think about the abstract merits and limitations of different views. But the question is, how do you distinguish between the ideal of freedom and that ideal of freedom as it is presented to the individuals that live under particular institutional systems, where often that ideal turns into a set of ideological assumptions? So what is the difference between freedom as an ideal, as a moral ideal to which all of us subscribe, regardless of our disagreements, regardless of our politics, just because we have the same conception of humanity, and freedom as an ideology that then translates this moral ideal into a set of rules and principles that people are asked to comply with and to subject to? So how do we think about this distinction between the moral concept of freedom and the slogans around freedom and the ideological presuppositions that are supposed to bring that freedom to bear into the lives of individuals? So my suggestion is to make that distinction, to think about contradictions in the experience of freedom and the tension between the moral ideals that we're committed to and the interpretation of those ideals by existing political institutions. And here I want to just give you a very simple example, but a salient one, because it bears on a question that everyone is concerned right now, which is the question of freedom of movement. So think about the ideal of freedom of movement. And I remember when I was about 11 years old, I had never left Albania. First time I left Albania was to travel to Greece with my grandmother. And Albanians up to that point, under communism, weren't allowed to travel outside their state. So if you tried to, you'd just be shot on the border. And I had always been told that to travel abroad, you need this document that is called a passport that only people who worked for the party could have, or people who had some business on behalf of the state. And they got it in ways that nobody knew how. And so I had actually never seen a passport in my life until I was 11 and a half. And then at some point, the Cold War ended. And of course, Albania went from being a country that restricted its citizens' freedom of movement to one where everybody could get a passport. And so we, my grandmother and I, applied for this passport, and we got it, as every other Albanian did. And so I remember I was really excited because I saw this red document, and I was saying to my grandmother, wow, now we can travel. And she said, no, we can't quite travel yet. And I said, but why? And she said, well, you also need something that goes on the passport, and that's called a visa. And a visa is not something that your state gives you, it's something that another state will give you. And unless you have a visa, you will be stopped at the border. So this was a really big disappointment, because I had always been told that all you need is a passport, and then the minute you get your passport, you discover that's actually not all you need. And so we discovered that having a passport wasn't enough, and indeed that having a passport didn't give you freedom of movement, because as it happened, freedom of movement wasn't just about you being able to leave your own state, you also had to be able to enter another state. And on that decision, it wasn't your state that was responsible, it was that other state. And it also turned out that if you actually traveled without the visa, and so you crossed the border, another state would capsize your boat, or would arrest you at the border, or would deport you, or would put you in a camp, or whatever. So it turns out that freedom of movement isn't realized just when you enable people to leave their country. You also need to realize it by enabling people to enter a particular country. And that was, I think, one of the first times where I thought, surely, if freedom of movement matters, it matters both in exits and in entrance. It matters both in emigration and in immigration. So how is it that when communist states restricted their citizens from leaving, they were criminals, but when capitalist states restricted other citizens from entering, they were just protecting their borders? And to me, that is a very clear, simple example of the difference between freedom as an ideology, that is to say, the ideology that makes us accept certain restrictions and naturalize them and normalize them and condemn other restrictions, and freedom as an ideal, so the ideal of freedom of movement. If I'm told to leave this lecture hall, and I say you all of us have a freedom to leave this room, but the door downstairs is closed, is that really freedom of movement? Or is it just that we've been told a story about how it only matters in some cases and in another case not? So just when Eastern socialist states were no longer shooting their citizens at the border, Western capitalist countries began to send boats to patrol their seas. And migrants were still dying, and what had changed was just the color of police uniforms and the color of the flags under which this all was being done. So I mentioned migration because it's a real salient issue in contemporary liberal democracies, but also because I think it's the prism from which to explore what is wrong with our current predicament, and why do we naturalize certain things and don't naturalize others? Why, when it's freedom for some but not for others, we don't worry about it. We think, well, the state surely has the right to control its borders, and then it depends on what kind of state had that kind of right. But also because I think it's the point from which to explore the relationship between freedom and democracy more broadly, and where we are all subjected to the same constraints. The world in which we live under is so integrated that when there is an injustice in one place, the effects of it are perceived in another place. Sometimes they're perceived as, catastrophes, sometimes they're perceived as political instability, sometimes they are perceived as fluxes of migration. But the point is that migration, for example, is just the prism from which you can question this idea of freedom of movement, and from which you can see what kind of injustices the world is made of, such that some people have to leave their countries and go and knock on the door of other countries. And believe me, nobody likes to leave their country. Everyone would rather be where they are. And so if they're going somewhere else, and if they're leaving all their affections, their relatives, their lives, their places that they're familiar with, the school they went to, it's not because they like better the sight of another place. It's because they are constrained where they are. And so they're looking for freedom, in a way. So we need to think about freedom, I think, to be able to tackle these kinds of challenges. We need to think about freedom as global freedom, and we need to think about democracy as global democracy. How do we do that? I think the crisis of democracy that we are witnessing has in some ways brought to light this weird tension. On the one hand, it has challenged globalization theories that sometimes diagnose the end of the state, and they told us that now it's all about markets and there are no longer agents that can control their borders or they can control their politics and so on. And on the other hand, it's shown us, these critics of globalization and the critics that we now witness to liberal globalizing projects have shown us that actually the state is still there. But on the other hand, they've also shown us the divide between the states that are still there and the ideals that the states were supposed to protect, including the idea of freedom. And that's because what makes the state morally appealing as an institution is that it promises to give individuals more freedom than they would have if they were by themselves. So we all subject to institutions, we all accept the authority of institutions because we think that when we join others and we make the laws that we all subscribe to, that we comply to, we have more freedom than the freedom that we had in the state of nature, where we were all just by ourselves. So the modern idea of democracy is tightly connected to this notion of freedom. and to this notion of freedom as legitimation, the idea that it's only if the state can preserve your freedom that the state can exercise power on you. And that's also the reason why it's the state and the state only that we trust to call emergencies when there is an emergency. So remember, in the lockdown, there was all this discussion about, is the state entitled to place restrictions on us? And the story was, well, of course, because the state is responsible not just for you, but also for you, for all of us. And so, and of course, if there was another authority that came and said, actually, I'm going to place you under restrictions, you wouldn't comply. You wouldn't stay at home. You wouldn't do what you're told to do. So this idea of democratic legitimation is exactly why the state and the state only, because it gives us freedom, it can also take that freedom from us if it's justified in its assumption of exercising authority on others. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that most of the freedoms that the state guarantees in its founding legal documents, in its main constitutional treaties in liberal democracies, can also, as you know, be suspended or restricted when the state calls the kinds of emergency that we have seen its call. And so you remember that the suspension of democratic norms during the pandemic was justified by invoking this higher order threat to freedom, where we were told that we can suspend these rules, or we can suspend these freedoms, the freedom to move, the freedom of children to play in the playground, the freedom to visit relatives, the freedom to leave your country, because our fate is tied with the fate of our fellow citizens, and so we have a kind of collective responsibility. And so it's not just my freedom, but it's our freedom jointly that is served better if we accept these rules, and if we accept the theory of legitimation of the state that is behind that set of rules. And so we were told, remember, we were told we were at war, and we were told that we fight an invisible enemy, and that we had to sacrifice some of our individual freedoms for the sake of this greater freedom that would protect the life of everyone equally. And by and large, we all accepted that, and I think we were reasonable to accept that. And that's because the state told us to do so, and no other institution could have done what the state told us to do. So that was the return to sovereignty in practice, and that was the assertion of the value of sovereignty in theory. But I think the idea that we all share the same threats is actually a myth, and it's also an ideology. And it's also increasingly a rhetorical device that is presented to all of us to make sure that we all comply, when in fact we are not all served by the state in the same way. So just again to go back to the example of the pandemic, in the same week in which 22 million Americans lost their job, billionaire US wealth increased by 10%. In the UK, black people were 4 times more likely to die than white people. And during the quarantine, domestic violence rose, and it was labeled intimate terrorism because women were suffering disproportionately from domestic violence compared to men. And also the burdens of caring for elderly people or for children, or the return to work was much more difficult from certain categories of people than it was for other categories of people. The attainment gap, if you think about education, the attainment gap for certain children from poor backgrounds and the gap that was created from the staying at home was also much larger if you came from a certain social class. The long-term psychological consequences, people who suffered from anxiety and depression and suicide rates, these were also all connected to socioeconomic status and socioeconomic background, because people didn't have the same means to access a psychologist or a therapist or a lawyer or whatever they would have needed at that point. And I'm not even going to go into the question of what it meant for countries like mine, like Albania, to be told that we didn't have access to vaccines and that people could die when other countries were just hoarding vaccines prepared for the 15th wave of the pandemic. They were already fine with the emergency that they had. They had enough vaccines, but they were just hoarding because they never knew what would happen after. Meanwhile, in Albania, people were dying on a daily basis because we didn't have access to vaccines. So that's the liberal institutional framework that we live under. And that's to say that liberal society is not free from fear. In some ways, if you go back to these examples, in some ways it fares worse than the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, at least powerlessness, we're all powerless, and powerlessness is evenly distributed. Whereas in this so-called civilized condition, it's worse because we mostly take for granted our duty to comply with authorities, and we don't really think about the huge discrepancies that the state has in being able to offer protection to everyone. So we're all asked to make the same sacrifices, but institutions fail people in different ways and sometimes in disproportionately burdensome ways. So emergencies are short-term phenomena, and I think they tell us something really important about the long term. And what they tell us is that the threat to freedom isn't just the crisis that we face, but it's how you prepare for a crisis, how you manage that crisis. And the threat to freedom is a condition of permanent emergency that lies ahead if you're not prepared for crisis, if you don't know, if you haven't set up the institutional system in such a way that you are resilient to the emergence of crisis. And that's because emergency rule sets up a precedent for this unprecedented control of all kinds of authorities on our lives, from scientific experts to data controlling authorities, to economic and to political elites that rely on the authority of the state to command obedience on everyone, but when in fact the relationship to the state of citizens has broken down because the social contract isn't serving everyone's freedom equally. So the state loses its authority, and representative democracy then loses its function as the mechanism that makes that authority legitimate. You don't trust your leaders, you don't trust politicians, you don't trust elites anymore. So politics ends up being the voice of the strongest and of people who have data or money or weapons or a combination of all of these. And the state ends up holding monopoly over the use of power, but actually has no legitimate authority. So I think that's why the question of political progress is connected to the challenge of rethinking the foundations of democracy as the system that is supposed to serve best freedom in light of our historical experiences. On the one hand, the failure of socialism in Eastern Europe, which I think tells us that some freedoms, the first generation freedoms, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of protest, these shouldn't be negotiable. And that's what we learned from that kind of failure, that these first generation freedoms are really important because a state that doesn't guarantee those freedoms is broken, has no legitimate authority. But we must couple that protection of these first generation freedoms with robust guarantees on social freedoms as well. The freedom to flourish, the freedom to realize people's moral potential, because these first generation freedoms, they need to be meaningful. And if I say to someone, you have freedom of thought, but you have absolutely no access to culture, then what does that freedom of thought mean proportionately to someone else? Or if I tell you that you have freedom of thought, but actually all our thoughts here are disciplined by data controlling agencies and by algorithms that take our data and make profit out of them, that's also not obviously freedom of thought. So that's something there going wrong. So I think a meaningful engagement with the question of freedom requires thinking the foundations of democracy, and a meaningful foundation of democracy requires re-engaging, because socialism is already dead, engaging with the question of capitalism and the crisis of capitalism, and raising the question of whether actually capitalism in its combination with liberalism as a historical phenomenon can really be a progressive force, whether you can have real freedom in this combination of liberalism and capitalism. So I now want to, this is the second part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the relationship between capitalism and liberalism. And I'm not going to do that by going back to the critics of capitalism, so no Marx, no Engels, no capitalists that supported communism. I actually want to go back to the early defenders of liberalism and capitalism, but also the pathologies that they identified in this combination of liberalism and capitalism when they go hand in hand. So I have a small historical bracket, middle part of the lecture, where I want to talk about the fact that liberalism is, yes, a broad church, and liberalism is not the same as capitalism. Capitalism is a set of political and economic relations. Liberalism is a set of ideals about freedom. So while capitalism wouldn't be capitalism without the support of liberal theories, not all liberal theories support capitalism. And so you have the example of someone like John Stuart Mill, for example, or other liberal John Rawls, who have been very critical of capitalism and indeed defended alternative forms of social organization like property-owning democracy and liberal socialism and so on. And I want to go back to those kinds of positions to just highlight some of the contradictions of this liberalism and capitalism when they go together, when they're fellow travelers, and what happens to freedom when that is the case. So that puts liberalism in a curious position. To the extent that it travels with capitalism, it's just a historical phenomenon. You could have liberalism without capitalism. To the extent that it departs or it qualifies capitalism, it's a social ideal. The social ideal is freedom, and the promise is freedom from fear. So for progressive liberals, for people who care about liberalism, and bracket capitalism for a minute, the question is, does the failure of capitalism doom also liberalism, or can you rescue liberalism from capitalism? And so forget about capitalism, but have a version of liberalism that is better served in an alternative system. And if liberalism should be understood as an ideal rather than the reality under which we live, to what extent can we make sense of these contingent encounters between liberalism and other systems, like liberalism and fascism, liberalism and social democracy, liberalism and socialism, liberalism and theocracy, and so on? Now, as I see it, liberalism in its combination with capitalism, so as a historical phenomenon, can't actually deliver freedom from fear. So that's the promise that it makes, is that it can make all of us free from fear. And I think it can't deliver freedom from fear because liberal societies, in their encounter with capitalist economic structures and state-based political institutions, generate pathologies of their own. And these pathologies are different from the fear of despotism that motivated liberalism, but I think they're also destructive in their own right. And I'm now going to talk about 3 pathologies that liberalism and capitalism generate when they encounter. The first one is moral anthropology. The second one is the theory of economics, and the third one is the theory of politics. And with all of these 3, I just want to highlight some of the contradictions that critics of liberalism, who are themselves liberals, pointed out in the early days in which liberalism was a project that was much more critical of itself than it is now, where people were actually looking at the systems that they had created in the eye and highlighting what were the tensions and what were the contradictions. So let's start with the anthropology of liberalism. A lot of people approved, and actually Marx was one of them, the fact that liberalism delivers individuals freedom compared to the kinds of authoritarian structures that they are supported by in the pre-modern period. So liberalism is an emancipatory political theory, and in its combination with capitalism, it liberates people from the yoke of authority. Some of you will be familiar with this very famous sentence in Marx's Communist Manifesto, where he says the bourgeoisie has torn down all Chinese walls. And the first part of that text, as you know, is an apology of liberalism and capitalism, saying how many great things capitalism has actually done. And that's because the idea was that in the promotion of commercial society, this notion of the doux commerce that Montesquieu advanced, there was an overall contribution that liberalism in its encounter with capitalism made to prosperity and economic well-being. And so there was a celebration of the importance of the individual, and a theory that said that the more individuals promote their material goods, the more benefits there will be for everyone else after. So the theory was, again, as a lot of you will be familiar with, the private vices, public virtues. So we can all go on and pursue our individual good, but there will be eventually a return for all of us and a delivery of freedom for all of us. But a lot of people who were studying commercial society and people who were otherwise sympathetic to liberalism also pointed out that the contradictions that commercial society generated. So they said that the project encourages selfishness, that it encourages greed, that it encourages envy, that it encourages distrust, that it encourages competition for inessential and for luxury goods, and a desire for recognition by others, and an exaggeration of appearances, and a desire to impress, and a need to be externally recognized, and rivalry, and often also indifference to the fate of vulnerable people who are perceived as people who just deserve their poverty or deserve their fate of being victims, in a way. And so in a way, the birth of this moment of individual caring for your own, for pursuit of your own good and so on, came hand in hand with the escalation of social inequalities, which also went hand in hand with the emergence of luxury and, as I say, this idea that some people care about things that are extra expensive when others don't even have anything to end the day with. So that led to a pattern of accumulation that brought extreme enrichment for some people at the expense of extreme destitution of others. And that was the moral pathology at the heart of this development of liberalism, capitalism. So it encourages social dispositions that aren't necessarily other-oriented or altruistic. Now, let me focus on the economic elements. So take the relationship between economic theory and the theory of the state. A lot of early critics of capitalism were pointing out that while a lot of liberals celebrated commercial society, they also needed the state to guarantee its functioning. So you can't have private property if you don't have guarantees of property. You can't have property if you don't have law. And you need someone who can actually guarantee that people will stick to their contracts and to their deals and to their agreements. And so this is why the concept of rights that we often associate with the notion, with the triumph of liberalism over other institutions, this concept of individual rights was so important because it ended corporate representation and it gave a stake to individuals and ended individuals' subservience to alternative authorities like the church or like the family or like the aristocracy. So people were now in control of their fates, they were master of their fate, and the individual rights that the state gave them enabled them to have this control over their lives and over their fates. But this universal idea of citizenship and rights was also constantly threatened by the conflict between commercial society and the state. And that's because on the one hand, the state is necessary to guarantee property rights and to guarantee the kinds of rights and obligations that enable contracts to function and that enable all of us to have access to these goods. On the other hand, the state doesn't have many revenues of its own. It relies on taxation. It relies on the kinds of money that private actors supply to it to be able to advance. And so it relies on the resources that the markets allocate to be able to function. So all of these early liberals, they noticed that the state relies on taxation and the contribution of the rich to its finances and to the preservation of order and of stability. But depending on how much you tax and what kind of welfare measures you have, you can have more or less inequality threaten stability. So the more you tax, the more you can control inequality. The more you tax, the better able you are to preserve order and stability, because then the poor are not rebelling against the state. So in a way, what that dialectic shows you is that all the old divisions of class and status return, except that they are the divisions between the property less and the property more, and it becomes a question of how much the state is able to control this tension between these different social groups to be able to guarantee the functioning of the kind of society that it's trying to promote. And so what does the state do to deal with this problem? It outsources, and again, I'm not saying anything new here, this is all what people who are writing about commercial society, Hume onwards in the 18th century, were writing. What does the state do? It outsources the problem by relying on the credit and debit system. So that's the way it can patch up domestic inequality, by taking the conflict outside its border and creating international anarchy. So, as people like Kant observed, in a way, the commercial society, far from ending war, just cultivates a rivalry of a different kind. A rivalry not now between individuals in the state, but between states in the international arena. And so commercial society expands outwards, and in expanding outwards, it comes with a contest, competition for resources outside the states, outside core liberal states, including encouraging colonial exploitation and the plundering of global resources. And that's one of the reasons why someone like Fichte, who was an early liberal but then became more and more critical of liberalism, ends up rejecting globalization exactly on these grounds, because he says actually the state, with its capitalist development, is unable to contain global conflict, and so Fichte thought the solution is the closed commercial state, which is not a good solution, but was a good diagnosis to a problem that we had then and we still have now. And that was because Fichte was opposing to the totalitarianism of the market, the totalitarianism of the state, and some of his prescriptions are actually very similar to the kinds of theories that you see with the far sovereigntist, far-right advance right now when they're talking about the problems of globalization and so on. So that leads me to the third source of fear that is distinctive to liberal capitalism. Classical liberals try to limit the role of the state, but they celebrated civil society. They celebrated the expansion of commercial society as part of a four-stage theory of history that a lot of liberals were subscribing to. So what did the theory of history, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Miller, especially Scottish Enlightenment writers, what did this theory of history say? it said basically that history is the history of relations articulated through different kinds of civilizations. So you have first the hunter-gathering civilization, then you have a pastoral civilization, then you have agricultural civilization, then you have commercial society, and that is the highest stage of development of human dispositions. So they hope that the global expansion of commercial society, which is the highest stage of these social relations, will bring with it unlimited technological improvement and material development. Now, this narrative of hope, with the stage theory of history, that, by the way, is something that a lot of socialists and Marxists took from liberals and also appropriated. So the philosophy of history that people always associate to Marx and Engels and so on is already there in this 18th century liberalism. The price of liberal hope in this triumph of civil society is that alternative forms of life, the hunter-gatherer and the agricultural, are considered to be inferior to historical development because they don't encourage the expansion of commercial society. So what that means is that this leads to encouraging a confrontation with people who are wedded to these alternative forms of social organization as people who are in need of liberal re-education. And so here, again, liberalism produces its own distinctive fear, which is the fear of colonialism and of empire. And this fear is not a collateral damage. It's not something that it just happens accidentally. It's intrinsic to the liberal mission to bring the virtues of civil society and of commercial society to people who are otherwise thought to be unable to have them because they don't have the market structures that they need to have this kind of civilization. So this is why liberals often nowadays, it's very unfashionable to talk about the relationship between liberalism and capitalism and colonialism, because liberals are made very uncomfortable by this problematic legacy of this relationship. And they kind of brush it aside and say, well, now we decolonize and we can be critical and we can deal with our imperial legacies in particular ways and so on. But notice that if there wasn't this intrinsic connection between the utopia of commercial society and liberalism's civilizing mission, you wouldn't explain why even people who were otherwise critical of their societies like Tocqueville or like John Stuart Mill, and who didn't necessarily condone all the excesses of capitalism, it's because they thought this is a model of civilization that is superior, that they were okay in the end with the expansion to the outside, to the extra-European world. And so their reasons aren't accidental reasons, they are reasons intrinsic to the liberal moral outlook. They're intrinsic to the realization of global commercial society. And so the fear of colonialism, and I think nowadays it's not the fear of colonialism, it's the fear of neo-colonialism in the form of debt dependency, or in the form of subservience to liberal international institutions, or in the form of humanitarian intervention. All of these aren't just accidental consequences of this episode in which liberalism and capitalism went hand in hand, but are the result of a theory of history in which liberal capitalist society is the final stage of a process that culminates in the liberation of the barbarians and of backward people like Albanians and others from their stupidity and oppression. So all these elements, I think, speak to a more general question concerning the liberal understanding of freedom and its relationship to power. Liberals try to limit the power of the state and of religious authorities and of any form of collective organization that threatens individual freedom. But as I try to show, in its efforts to disperse power, the project generates its own forms of power structures, its own sets of fears, and its own kind of unfreedom. The problem is that liberal power structures are anonymous. And they are not personal. You can't say it's the party, or it's the state, or it's this individual, or it's this other individual, or this political leader. And they're spontaneous, they're not planned. And they are more consolidated, more connected to psychological attitudes to just do your own thing than to the actual active desire to harm someone. No capitalist wants to harm anyone. No liberal capitalist wants to, they want to do good. The problem is that the project, as it's been institutionally configured, ends up creating a kind of fear and the inability to deliver from that fear, to liberate people from that fear, that is in a way no less concerning and no less pervasive than the alternatives that liberals are concerned by and try to abolish. And if anything, it might be more pernicious, because when freedom, when power is dispersed and is anonymous and is spontaneous and is created by neglect rather than by active desire to harm someone else, it's even more difficult to fight. So the right, the far right and the anti-liberals that are now around and that are hegemonic, they have convinced us that the conflict that we face is a conflict that is reducible to a kind of liberal cosmopolitan versus communitarian cleavage. And the right has been very successful because it's been able to persuade citizens that the problems of capitalism can be reduced to problems of political membership. And so they say, as long as you police the boundaries of your community, as long as you restrict rights to some people, then you will take care of the issues with globalization. And so they say, you know, if you resolve the question of who belongs in whatever group, you will have resolved the conflicts of our time. But migration, membership in a group, as I mentioned earlier, isn't a problem in itself, is a symptom of a crisis. And if the question of political progress is, you know, how can we avoid the errors of the past, exclusion and returning to policing the boundaries of membership can't be the solution, because we have also experienced the failure of these kinds of projects. And fascism in the 20th century was exactly that, was an effort to police the problems and to control globalization by policing membership. So an alternative or an effort or a progressive account of freedom needs to in some ways challenge the terms in which the relationship between freedom and democracy is articulated, especially by the right. And now I'm going to talk about the failure of the left, so the Western left now. That's where the left is also failing, because the left has endorsed this diagnosis of the problem as one of political membership. So the question of political progress is now considered to be a question of abstract law and rights. And so who shapes and who enacts the laws and who has a voice and who doesn't have a voice, who is included and who is excluded. So it's become a question of regulating the terms of political membership or group membership, rather than thinking about how do we challenge boundaries when the boundaries aren't the issue. It's globalization that is an issue. And so how can we think beyond these existing models that we have in a way that isn't obsessed with rights and who belongs and who doesn't? And so that's why the left, the only cause for the left is culture wars, has become identity politics, because they are about policing the boundaries of the social group. Not the state in this case, but which group you belong to, which identity you have. And so the only struggle that the left is left with is the one that takes the terms from the right and turns it into a question of political membership. So if the left doesn't move beyond the link between rights and culture to the question of democracy and capitalism, it's really hard to see how any of the solutions that they come up with will not just reproduce the conflict in the long run. Okay, so I'm now on my final few words. I said that we need to think about progress in the way that is both microhistory and macrohistory. And so in a way, we need to reconcile ourselves with, on the one hand, the presence of will in history, the fact that we make these laws and we create these institutions, but also the absence of free will, the fact that we are at the mercy of general social structures, and where the material conditions that we live under are always influenced and conditioned by something else in some way. So we need to think about history philosophically in a way that has to account for both freedom and free will, but also structures and the oppressive presence of structures. Now, philosophies of history have always often served as justifications for the status quo or for dominant ideas that had this kind of oppressive character, because I think they were linked to these civilizing projects that claimed to know what is the alternative. So they were too idealistic, and then in the name of those ideals ended up sacrificing and expanding. I think a more pragmatic approach to history taken philosophically would suggest that history is a process of trying to learn from the mistakes and the failures of the past. And so progress in this context requires working to refine the principles of justice that work and eliminating those that don't work. So that is to say, involves opening up societal perspectives and democratic ideas that take the whole world and not just one individual and not just one particular social group as the unit of concern. And in other words, progress is going back to this Enlightenment tradition that is also very much vilified, including by the left these days, which is the definition of the process of emerging from people's self-incurred immaturity, from the dogmas of tradition, from state-centric culture, from perceptions about immutability of the market, and also from entrenched identity politics. And while I agree with Marx that the economy and prevailing political and economic power influence cultural patterns and trends, that doesn't imply that there are no opportunities for people to make use of the spaces that are available, like this one. So it's important to use these spaces to think critically about the future and to challenge the institutions that we live under if we care and if we acknowledge that we all ultimately care about the same basic principles and basic values, and if we think that in the end, regardless of these different political points of view, the concern with freedom is something that shapes everyone. So I'm just going to leave you now really final words with this question of how does change happen if you think about progress in this way? How does progress occur? And actually, I will leave you with an ambiguity because this is where I don't have the answer. So on the one hand, I think my project is the project of the Enlightenment. It's the project of intellectual work, the project of critique, of highlighting moral double standards, of pointing out between the kind of contradiction between the ideal of freedom on the one hand and the institutional reality of freedom on the other. And I also think that freedom is connected to moral agency, and so it's neither the freedom of the long-gone socialist world, nor the freedom of the struggling, agonizing capitalist world, but it comes from an awareness of our moral connectedness and our moral responsibilities, coupled with a duty to both look at the past in the eye and engage with the problematic legacy of all these traditions and the way they have engaged with micro-histories in the long run, and also with institutional reality and with the future and what we owe to future generations and to people who are not there yet, but who will come after us and inherit what we give them. On the other hand, I'm also a materialist. So I don't think that if we don't collectively change material incentives, and if we don't democratize the market, if we don't transform political institutions, if we don't think about going beyond state-centric solutions to the kind of challenges that we face, I think there will always be a gap between how the world appears to us and how the world should be. And so, morally speaking, I think a world that is made of asymmetries in the distribution of power, in the distribution of opportunities, of material resources, or of the production of knowledge, isn't a free world. And I think, because we're all interconnected, a world in which not everyone is free is a world that can't really be truly free for any one of us and any one of you. Thank you. Do I come down? Come on down, come here.
Well, thank you very, very much, Lea. That was a charismatic and overwhelming conference, and we are almost a little bit intimidated by it, even here in one of the world's most important cities of capitalism. There is the first amendment of the Constitution of the Swiss Institute of International Studies, which says there's the freedom, the right for freedom to ask questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, seize the opportunity, ask questions, and you're even allowed to contradict if you have, as you have seen, good arguments. So, who would like to put the first questions here in the middle?
So I'm referring to the ideal of democracy you mentioned in your last podcast, which I listened to. And I live in Switzerland, and I think about Switzerland as a very democratic state. And a lot of people think that too, because we vote a lot for different initiatives and referendums. But 1/4 of the population doesn't have the right to vote. And how far or how close do you think Switzerland is from the ideal of democracy?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question, because I think it's one of the cases where but the fact that it's not universal doesn't mean that it's bad as it is. I'm actually a very big fan of the Swiss model, and I think the more voice you give people, the better it is. And if you start saying, oh, it's very problematic if you have voice because there are exclusions, that's an argument not to restrict democracy, but to expand it. So I think the points that you raise is really important, and I think it's the question with migration all over. There are people who have a stake in the political institutions that they subject to, that abide by the rules, that take the rules, that are given the rules by politicians, but don't actually have the freedom to respond and to engage with those rules also critically. So I think that is a very good argument to say that migration is exactly not about policing membership, it's about understanding that it only becomes an issue politically because it reflects a larger problem, and the larger problem is one that requires solutions that aren't just the ones that nation states can offer, but what nation states can do and what progressive actors can do within nation states is exactly to make the case that since it's not about migrants in or migrants out, you should be able to open up democracy as much as you can within the sites in which you have that democratic decision-making. And that's also a question of basic freedom. So the migrants that can't vote, for example, or the migrants that take the rules, they're exactly like workers used to be in the 19th century. They're disenfranchised because they didn't have property. Now you have universal franchise, but you have a category of people who live within particular territories that are disenfranchised because they don't have the right passport, or because they haven't lived here for long enough, or whatever.
Right, we're still working on that. There's another question.
Mirmrama Lea, that was Albanian for the others. I have a short question about let's call it the catastrophe of the 20th century, how communism and socialism went wrong. Is it rather that we didn't get Marx right, or that, let's say, Marx didn't get some things right, maybe he didn't get Hegel the right way? And the second question is, how do you see it in the Balkans? Do you see there's some kind of hope that this ideal of freedom can be actualized?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I don't think the problem is that we didn't get Marx right. The problem is that we thought Marx has the answers, and no author has the answers, actually. The work of criticism is the work of taking whatever you can from whichever author, including liberal, capitalist, Marxist, socialist, all these different traditions, and then you go on the shoulders of these giants and you look at the future and you try and think for yourself, in a way. So I think the problem with the 20th century is a very 20th century real-world socialism. It's a very complicated question, one that you can't really answer just by saying, is it about the right philosophy or the wrong philosophy? You need to think at the circumstances under which these projects emerged. I happen to think that it wasn't a coincidence that the fact that it went wrong in a part of the world where there were no first-generation rights to start with. And so Albania, as you know, just to give you an example, in 1945 was a country where 95% of people couldn't read and write. And where, if you have that kind of population, you don't really have first-generation freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and so on. So then it becomes really easy for a state to clamp down on even more, because they were starting from nothing. And so then it becomes a question of not going through this importance of liberal freedoms, and I think socialism is not the kind of project that you can realize if you don't care about liberal freedoms, because it's a spin-off of liberalism. It's not an alternative. It's something that delivers on the same freedoms but more. So it's liberalism plus, in a way. And I think the fact that in Eastern Europe all of these states were emerging from the collapse of empires, the Ottoman, the Habsburg, the Russian, all of that configuration, the fact that they needed to develop the nation state alongside this internationalist project that wasn't really about defending the nation state, created contradictions that then enabled political elites to realize certain projects that ended up in tragedy and in failure. But I don't think the right attitude in Albania is to say Marx was wrong, and I don't think the right attitude in the West is to say Marx was right. And this is exactly the problem. So if you put these two discourses together, Eastern Europeans only care about history. They will tell you philosophy is all rotten because we know it all, we've lived it, forget about the ideas. If you come to Western Europe and you meet the Western Marxists, all they care about is the philosophy, and the history is like, oh, it's just these backwards people, they didn't really know how to do it, or it didn't work out, but it'll work out for us when we do it, it'll be fine. And that's another problem. So in one case, it's a kind of reification of history, and the other case is reification of thought. And I don't think you make progress by thinking either about thought or history in those terms. You have to think about the political process. The problem with the Balkans, I think, is actually the lack of faith at the end. So at the bottom of it, I mean, economically and politically, the problems of the Balkans are the problems of the world. It used to be the case that, you know, the socialist states had their own homemade problems, and Albania was a very good example because it was so isolated that it was so autarkic, and so it had no debt, no nothing. So all the problems that it had were problems that were self-created, and now all the problems that we have are the problems of the world. The problem is that we have emerged from this collapse of these two ideologies, and so we have faith in nothing. People need some kind of, you know, in liberal capitalist societies it's great because people still somehow believe in liberalism, and that keeps them going. And so that's why when they have a problem, the solution to the problem is not to kind of fight the system, is to kill yourself or to be socially disintegrated or not to belong. So the belonging doesn't take the form. In Eastern states, the pathology takes the form of exit. So in Albania, people think, if I just leave Albania, I'll be fine. If I go to the UK, I'll be fine. In the UK, people don't think that. They think, well, I just leave the world, in a way. Or I just, the kind of pathologies are also pathologies of alienation, but alienation takes a different form in these societies. And the form that I think it takes in the Balkans is particularly devastating, because if you don't have faith and if you don't have confidence that you can come up with an alternative, and that alternative is not the one that the EU gives you, or the NATO gives you, or the US gives you, where it's an alternative that you generate yourself, then you will always feel inadequate, and you will always feel that the others have worked it out and you haven't. And I think that's the biggest problem in Albania and in the Balkans.
Absolutely. More questions, please, here.
From the balcony, maybe?
Okay.
How do you see the globalization as a chance for more freedom, or maybe as a challenge for the capitalism in general?
Well, I think it's both, right? So it expands on certain freedoms, but it also generates contradictions, and the kinds of contradictions that I was exposing, right? The contradictions with the asymmetries of power, with the fact that the states who are more advanced in this global project have an advantage and shape the rules on their image, and the states who are there, like our states, take the rules and don't really have much agency. But I think, again, the question is, how can you think about the crisis that we have in a way that enables you to overcome the crisis by learning from the past? And to learn from the past, you have to be open to both of these alternatives, and to the failures, but also to the successes of both of these systems.
This is a trial and error system. You mentioned that in the last paragraph of your speech. Yeah. Okay, here was a gentleman, please.
Can we have some women?
Here, just pass.
I wanted to know, when you said when you have been under 11, there was no possibility to get a passport when you not had like a special position in politics. Was it like commonly known there is passports, but like 99% didn't got one? Or was it like no one really know about the system of a passport and it was not possible to get one?
I only remember actually finding out that you needed a passport at the point in which it became possible to have one. My grandmother had this old passport. She had lived through pre-communism in Albania, so she had an old passport of when she was in the Zog period, so the monarchist period of Albanian history, just before fascists. And she had this ID that she said, with this you could travel. But my grandmother had this sentence. She would say, the roads were open, and now the roads are closed. And so all I knew were that the roads were closed. I didn't really know that there was this thing that would open the roads for you. It's only when we could actually have the passport that I discovered that the passport was the kind of thing that would open the roads, except it turned out you also needed a visa. So it didn't open all the roads.
Next question, please. Back there, two.
Thanks, it was magnificent. My question, could you give a reasoning of why to put freedoms at the center of our concerns, or why take them as a starting point?
Because I think that it's because of fear. And so we all worry about coercion. The fear that we all have in political theory, people say the fear of the state of nature was the fear of someone doing something to you. And that's a primitive fear about not being an agent, not being able to do what you want to do, not being able to realize your goals. And so it's to that primitive instinct or desire or moral imperative, however you want to couch it, depending on what moral theory you subscribe to, that the theorization of freedom as the center of all political questions and systems is speaking to. And then you have further discussions around, what is justice, what is equality, what is solidarity. But I think freedom is a kind of primitive value in a way, because it speaks to this idea of what does it mean to be an agent? What does it mean to be in control of your life, to be in control of your fate?
Absolutely. So another question down there.
Presentation. I have a question. What would Shoki Enver think about the current state of Albania if he would be alive? I know it's more like a fun question, but also what you would think about the current state and particularly in the question of freedom.
I mean, I don't think it's very difficult. You can just go and read what the North Korean leader says about the world, and that's what he would say about the world as well. It's exactly the same discourse. So it's, there are many reincarnations of Shoko Enver in contemporary politics in lots of different, not in Albania, but in many other different parts of the world, and they all have more or less the same discourse. And so I think it's all we need to do is just go and Google, check what one of these leaders says about imperialism, about capitalism, and that's what they would say about the stage that Albania is currently in.
Yeah, actually, I mean, freedom is the worst case scenario for them, absolutely. They have to do everything that never freedom comes into reality, as we see now, current world affairs. It's absolutely horrific. There's another question.
Hi, Lea. So thanks, this is fascinating. So insofar as the European Union is an experiment in living and in institutions, should we have faith in it, or should we start criticizing it?
Both. I think we should be critical to the extent that the European Union, as it's currently conceived, it's mainly an economic project, and it's really failing on the democracy project. And so it's mainly about the architecture, the institutional architecture of the EU is such that it prioritizes economic freedom at the expense of political freedom and also distributive justice and social justice more generally, but also at the expense of political integration, without which you don't really make much progress in distribution if you don't have political integration. But on the other hand, I don't think we should trash the European Union, because I think it's one of the most amazing experiments in going beyond the nation state. And the fact that it's still there, and it came out of this profound conflict in the Second World War between France and Germany, and you have these fundamental historical enemies that create something together, and that they can put aside all their long centuries of disagreements and territorial disputes and come up with this alternative model. For people like the Balkans, where we're still torn by these disputes and territorial conflicts and national and ethnic grievances, that is an example of actually how you could build together and how you can functionally integrate. So I think if you criticize the EU, you have to make sure that you say that it's from a constructive perspective rather than just being critical, and because the risk is that the EU gets replaced with something that's much worse than the EU, and that is the world of nation states that the EU is trying to emerge from. And the other thought is that, as if you think about Machiavelli and philosophies of histories and so on, the EU is it's only had a very short life, so it's in infancy. And it's important to develop the project rather than to say, oh, it failed, because it's still early days of experimenting, and you can only build better if you criticize it, but when you criticize it, I think you have to criticize it from a position of someone who supports the overall idea, and I'm very much in favor of the overall idea.
Could almost be a Swiss answer, We are getting closer. Next question, here please.
Hi, Lea. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for writing your book. I read it, and I couldn't stop reading it. What I found very fascinating is because you have these two women's role models in your book, your mom, Dali, and your grandmother, Nini. And I found a part very interesting and very funny to read, and this is the part where you describe your mom's opinion about the women's quota. Now, would you please tell us a little bit about your opinion about the women's quota, especially when it comes to freedom? I mean, of course, it decreases the freedom of, finding the employer you want, but what does it mean for you in a society?
Yeah, my position on actually all of these questions that go on identity conflicts and identity issues is that we need to find the grounds. I think there is an a common ground in these types of oppression. And so if you isolate them, then you only make progress in one, but you don't make progress in the other. So just to give you the example, I think my mother in the book says something with which I completely agree with, which is it's all about quota, it's all about ticking boxes and opening spaces for women and so on. But what about women migrants? And I often say when I go and give talks about women in philosophy and people say, oh, aren't you empowering and we should have more women in philosophy? And I say, well, yes, but that's only because I have migrant women who look after my children, that I'm paying for them to do the work that I can't do. So, and that's to say that questions of economic disintegration and marginalization, questions of gender oppression and questions of racial oppression, I don't think should be isolated from each other. There's a ground, and it's a complicated discussion of how they come together, but I think it's a failure of the left currently that it is unable to go beyond these tokenistic approaches to each of them, where it's all about expanding the group rather than thinking about how do these different groups interact with each other. And on a more personal level, I actually, because I guess maybe I grew up with this, what people now call role model, I actually was never aware of the fact that I was a woman and being a woman was a problem somehow for being able to speak publicly and engage and interact in discourse. Also in part because in Albania, most people who did the more kind of demanding jobs were women. And so, you know, they all worked, they were all, but they were doing everything. So my mom always said that in socialist states, women did the care work, the domestic work, the work in the state, they worked in the mine, they were doctors, they were engineers. And she somehow thought that these women in the West were complaining about the fact that, you know, either you could work at home or you could do work in the factory. These were like failed women, basically, because they weren't strong enough and so on. So this is where I came from. Except that to be able to do that, you need, when I then came in the West, and I came with this completely like gender-blind view, and all my friends, this is why I also never worked on feminism, all my colleagues who worked political theory, they often worked on feminism, and I just like, you know, feminism, why me? It could be anyone. And it just was never an issue, except that you do understand as you go on that there are structural constraints to women participation and to women engagement in the workplace. But these structural constraints, I don't think are ones that you can fix just by having another policy document on how to include women in the workplace without addressing the fundamental material inequalities that are at the basis of this kind of marginalization.
This is exactly the problem in Russia today also. So, maybe a last question. Nobody motivated anymore?
There's someone there.
You learned your lesson here? Okay. Last question.
Thank you. I had two questions, actually. The first is, you didn't tackle the issue of information, so freedom in information, I think probably because it is such a large topic, but we live in an era of a devastating possibility of information. So information is important to enhance freedom. And we know that all ideologies have used propaganda to limit or vehicle or in-channel freedom, but now we live in this period of incredible access to information, which could be more confusing than orienting. And the second question, we live on the, let us say so, on the bright side of the moon, there's a dark side of the moon. How can we bring light on the dark side of the moon? Exporting democracy has revealed itself a failure, an error. Is it possible to bring some light to the dark side of the moon?
Yeah, and I think maybe I'll start with the last one. I think it is possible, but it requires, again, a kind of switch in attitude. And that means that we don't divide the world between societies that have worked it out and societies that haven't worked it out. And that's the problem of exporting democracy. It's a kind of paternalist model where you think you can actually make anyone free. Now, you can't make people free. It's paradoxical, it's contradictory. You know, a freedom that someone gives you is not real freedom. Freedom is only freedom if you demand it, if you fight for it, if you manifest your search. It's in the moment in which you kind of become responsible for your own social conditions that you grow out of this, what Kant called immaturity, right? So I think that's, in a way, a lot of the problems with contemporary discourses is that the world is divided, and this is where it's similar to that civilizational narrative that I was talking earlier. It's divided between countries who have worked it out and countries who haven't, and the countries who haven't need to look up to the countries who have worked it out. And if you think about how the EU operates in the Balkans, if you look at the EU from the inside, it's a disaster. It's contradictions, tensions, problems. People are constantly asking themselves. If you look at the EU from the outside, it's the superhero that will save everyone, and it's the messiah, and we need to be part of the EU. And this is exactly what creates the kind of problem that it's trying to solve, because it creates the immaturity that is supposed to actually deliver people from their own immaturity. So the relationship that you have to reason is the wrong one. And I think that's why the question of democracy is one where it needs to be a challenge for everyone, and all of us need to understand that it's an ideal. There's places that are closer and further away, but even within the same country, you are in historical moments closer to it, and then you're further away from it. And I think now we're further away from it than we were 10 years ago. So in all of these societies, it's not that when you have democracy, you have it forever, and when you don't have it, you just become like the ones that have it forever, and that will solve it for you. I think that's just what's wrong with the kind of approach. Information, yes, I hinted at it a little bit when I was talking about this idea of the Enlightenment, that I was saying, Kant talks about the emergence from people's own immaturity, and that emergence is very much connected to this capacity to make public use of reason, so to argue and to criticize and so on. But we can't exempt from that criticism the question of how do you access information? Who controls information? Who incentivizes you to look for a certain kind of information and not another kind of information? So again, that's a question where you can't really discuss freedom of thought and freedom of speech if you don't think about what are the conditions under which we have a public sphere that is ideal in the way of arguing and exchange and so on. And again, on that as well, I don't think we're critical enough of how this information that we use and we access is actually being delivered to us. Where is it coming from? Who is it serving? And what is being done with what we share and so on?
Absolutely. So before we say goodbye with the procedure of the ritual of a gift, I would have to look at what's forthcoming in our fall cycles. Can we see the... Okay, I don't see it here. So the next speaker is coming soon. It's General Ben Hodge, about the war, the horrible, terrible, aggressive war against Ukraine, already on next Tuesday. I expect you all to attend, all. We will count. Will be brilliant, maybe also desperate, but this is a very, very important topic to defend freedom at its borders. Then we have Ambassador Dr. Heusgen, head of the Munich Security Conference, also a very important topic, a critical look at world affairs. Then we have Mary Elise Sarotti, American historian, about the treaties between the Soviet Union and the Western powers after the fall of the wall. And finally, Mary Ellen Iskandarian, President and CEO of Women's World Banking. I'm sure she is not a totally poor capitalist. So this is what we have for you. And then is soon Christmas, and I hope you remember the wonderful things we served you. And now, Lea, of course, that was again a very complicated research. We know your hobbies. We know, for instance, your reading list, your favorite books. So we didn't give you the Iliad by Homer because you have it. And so we thought it had to be connected somehow to Switzerland, and Switzerland, after all, is still some sort of an incarnation of freedom, because we started very early to kill the other ones. 700 years ago, we wanted to be free, and everybody who stood in the way was expelled. Or that's the tale we believe in. So, of course, it would have been possible to give you a carved statue of the incarnation of the hero Freedom William Tell. It would be absolutely horrific, an instrument of kitsch. No way. Also, the Swiss flag is a little bit too obvious, and maybe at customs you have the problems to show that. Nobody understands why you bring that. Is the Red Cross, or what is it? No. But we found a game which is the incarnation of capitalism in a really mean and also educational way.
Is it Monopoly?
Yeah, but not only Monopoly, but Zurich monopoly. So you see every spot in Zurich you can buy if you're clever enough, and you can teach your children to become true capitalists. And here you can see yourself. You have to come down because we made it, you see. Here, this is a brilliant racing car. It still works, hopefully. And there is the monopoly of Zürich. Zürich, as we say in Zürichdeutsch, and you have all the places you can buy. And I can say, if you have a problem, you ask me, I give you further hints how to win. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.